I beg to move that this House has considered the operation of the UK emissions trading scheme in Wales. And I'd like to begin by commending the cooperative approach taken by the UK and devolved governments in establishing this scheme. Indeed, by agreeing a common framework which treats each nation as equals and partners in our climate efforts, the scheme has brought coherence to one element of our combined efforts to achieve net zero. Of course, there is room for improvement, and I'd like to draw the Minister's attention to concerns raised by the Green Finance Observatory that, and I quote, "The elephant in the room is that offsets are fundamentally not about mitigating climate change or even about removing past emissions, but about enabling future emissions, about protecting economic growth and corporate profits." And I hope that the Minister may be able to reflect on those remarks when she sums up the debate. Now, nevertheless, this comment raises two critical questions. First, how will businesses fundamentally reduce their aggregate emissions, and to do so rapidly? And second, what is the role of government in facilitating this change? Now, in order to meet our climate targets, not only must we reduce overall emissions, but we must also adopt a carbon negative strategies. The most economical and natural of these, of course, is tree planting. And I hope to expand on this point today, and in doing so, make a case for more closely linking the UK ETS with a separate and voluntary carbon offset market. Now, both schemes encourage businesses to reduce overall emissions, and while currently unconnected in terms of policy, they do run parallel to each other. Now, while I accept that there are technical and policy challenges associated with directly incorporating carbon offsetting into the UK ETS, I do believe that an association between the two schemes, if established, would bring rigour, scrutiny and additional resources to the offsetting process. Now, governmental intervention is urgently required to bring much needed stability to the voluntary carbon offset market in Wales. My honourable friend, the member for Carmarthen East and Dynevor, has recently highlighted how large companies are already purchasing vast tracts of agricultural land in the Upper Teifi and Towy valleys for forestry and carbon offsetting, and are doing so in a manner which internalises financial gain and externalises the social, economic and cultural costs. These are costs which increasingly pose an existential challenge to Welsh farmers and rural communities, and are inimical to both efficient land use and a just transition. To echo the National Farmers Union, we urgently need to ensure a system that makes carbon offsetting meaning the right tree in the right place. Now, I believe the government, by acting as a broker and data-backed coordinator, can help ensure appropriate land use for carbon offsetting, support the sufficient scale of planting, and empower local farmers and rural communities to enter the carbon negative effort for themselves. Wales's forests are a natural, economic and national asset at the very heart of our decarbonisation efforts. The lungs of our nation, our forests sequester approximately 1.84 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent annually, while pollution removal by woodland was estimated to have an ecosystem value of over £385 million back in 2015. Our forests are also essential for our environment's biodiversity. Indeed, of the 542 listed species of principal importance by the Welsh Government, 210 rely wholly or partly on woodland habitats. I shall indeed, yes.
I wonder, would he also acknowledge the crucial importance of restoring Wales's peatlands, given that the climate change mitigation potential is 300,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide a year, equivalent to 5% of Wales's transport carbon emissions. I'm sure he would also take the opportunity to welcome the peat restoration projects led by Parc Cenedlaethol Eryri, Snowdonia National Park.
I thank my right honourable friend for that intervention, and indeed will join her in congratulating the work of the Parc Cenedlaethol. Peatland restoration will be an incredibly important part of our carbon mitigation and sequestration efforts, and I think that more work to ensure that local actors, such as the Parc Cenedlaethol, can fully benefit and engage in that process is the way that we as politicians and policymakers should focus in the future. The area of land covered by trees and woodland in Wales has tripled since the early 20th century, rising from 88,000 hectares in 1905 to over 309,000 hectares as of March 2020, and it accounts for about 14.9% of the Welsh land area. Now, while this is significantly greater in percentage terms than England and Northern Ireland, this coverage lags behind our Scottish cousins and is lower than both the European Union and wider European averages. So we have much further to go. The Woodlands for Wales strategy suggests increasing tree planting to at least 2,000 hectares per year from 2020. And the Climate Change Committee recognising the challenge of reaching net zero, has been even more ambitious, recommending an increase to woodland cover in Wales from present levels to 24%. Now, this would mean planting 43,000 hectares of new trees by 2030 and 180,000 hectares by 2050. Set against this backdrop, Welsh farming finds itself at a perilous junction, buffeted on the one hand by increased trade barriers with our largest market and uncertainty over future income support, and on the other, an increasing pressure on land use. Welsh land, like all land, is of course a finite resource, and if climate goals are to be met in a sustainable and fair manner, solutions cannot be imposed on rural communities. Instead, solutions can and should be implemented in conjunction with rural communities and in a way that protects them from any damaging consequences. Now, this is especially important when it comes to Welsh forestry and carbon sequestration. If it's to be successful in achieving the desired objectives of reducing carbon emissions and promoting biodiversity, then rural communities must be at the heart of their implementation. Welsh farmers play a vital but often overlooked role in the climate equation, with over 109,000 hectares, which accounts to just over a third of total woodland in Wales, located on Welsh farms. To fulfil the stated tree planting objective, therefore, we need to understand the implications for the farming and food and drink sectors that rely upon this agricultural land. Land that is also, I should mention, essential to the well-being of the rural economy. Now, at scale, concerns about food security are increasingly valid, and we must also account for the real risk of displacing food production elsewhere to countries which may have a higher carbon footprint and lower environmental standards. The last thing that any of us would want to happen is for an unregulated carbon offset market to bring about the perverse scenario whereby productive agricultural land in Wales is sold to large corporations for the purposes of carbon offsetting, while we increase our food imports from across the world. Such a scenario, namely the offshoring of our food production, would make a mockery of wider sustainability efforts. And I must warn the government that there are anecdotal examples of such a scenario beginning to take root in some parts of Wales, and as such, we must act now to ensure that it does not become widespread. Now, the best way forward, in my opinion, would be to increase the support for farmers and rural communities looking to enter the carbon offsetting market for themselves. At this point, I'd like to pay tribute to the fantastic work by academics based in Bangor University in this area. In particular, I'd like to thank Professor John Healy, Dr Prysor Williams, Dr Sophie Wyn-Jones, Dr Tim Priella and Ashley Hardacre for their outstanding research on this issue, which I do commend to the Minister. If she were to review their work, she'd note that the substantial barriers still exist to their entry by farmers and local landowners hoping to diversify into agroforestry. Here, I believe, the UK ETS could play a transformative role, not only in better regulating the offset market, but by providing the resources to encourage tree planting that is locally grounded rather than purchased by external big business actors. Practically, ETS revenues perhaps could be used to hasten the system of payments, as has happened in Ireland, I believe, so that farmers can afford to wait for a crop of trees to mature in order to derive an income stream. It could also include looking at land tenure restrictions to review contractual clauses prohibiting the planting of trees, especially important since over 30% of Welsh land is tenanted. Now, while such measures may seem parochial, they are fundamental to ensuring that we actually deliver a transition that is just as well as sustainable. We must work with farmers who manage over 80% of land in Wales to deliver a forested future critical to the overall success of our decarbonisation efforts. The alternative, where big business can buy land, plant trees without any reference to local biodiversity and the optimum use of different parcels of land, all the while continuing with their polluting business as usual practices, is unacceptable. Greenwashing, I know as the Minister will know, is an ever-present danger, but in this instance, it would devastate Wales's rural communities, culture and economy. So, in summary, Sir Edward, I hope the Minister will firstly address concerns that the ETS scheme is not moving fast enough or fundamentally reducing emissions. But I hope the Minister will agree that local groups and farmers should be supported to play an important part in the carbon offset market, and in so doing, lead the net zero transition. We must not allow large corporations to buy farms put rural communities out of home and land and weaken local food production for the sake of greenwashed business as usual. And more specifically, I'd welcome any thoughts the Minister might have on integrating carbon offsetting into the wider UK ETS framework to ensure that we have an effective regulation of the market, the promotion of sustainable practices and the rewarding of responsible practitioners. Now, I hope today's debate, short as it is, has demonstrated the need for cooperative action across the UK to ensure that our greener future is ecologically, socially and culturally sustainable, and therefore that the transition to it is a just one.